The moment Edna Archer pressed the stolen train ticket into the station master's hand and called herself Clara Voss, she felt the lie settle over her like a second skin, and she prayed to God it would hold long enough to carry her out of Missouri and into a new life. The year was 1878, and the Kansas Pacific Railway station at Kansas City hummed with a particular kind of desperation that Edna knew well. It smelled of coal smoke, sweat, boot leather, and the sharp metallic tang of ambition. Women in traveling dresses clutched carpet bags to their chests. Men in dusty hats argued over cargo manifests. Children wove between legs like river water finding its course. And somewhere in all that chaos, Edna Archer, 24 years old, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, and running from a life she had not chosen, stood in line with a ticket that bore another woman's name. Clara Voss had been her closest friend since childhood, the daughter of a clockmaker in St. Joseph. 3 weeks ago, Clara had written to Edna in a fever of excitement about a teaching position she had secured in a small town called Harlo Creek, deep in the Kansas territory. A job arranged through a church organization that placed educated women in frontier communities. Clara had packed her trunk, kissed her mother, and then promptly fallen off a horse 2 days before departure and broken her collarbone so badly the doctor had ordered 6 weeks of absolute rest. Edna had not planned to steal Clara's identity. She had simply arrived at the station to return the unused ticket on Clara's behalf, and then she had stood there, holding it, and thought about the man she was supposed to marry at the end of the month. His name was Harold Briggs. He was 43 years old, owned 3 properties in Kansas City, and had made it quietly clear during their courtship, a courtship arranged entirely by her uncle, who held the deed to the house Edna lived in, that he expected a wife who would be silent, presentable, and grateful. Edna had watched him at dinner one evening tap the table sharply with 2 fingers whenever her aunt spoke out of turn, and she had felt something cold and irrevocable settle in her chest. She had not slept well since, so she had done the only logical thing a woman in her position, holding a valid train ticket to somewhere else, could possibly do. She had gotten in line. The station master, a round little man with red suspenders and ink-stained fingers, barely glanced at the ticket or at her. "Miss Voss," he said, stamping it with practiced disinterest and handing her the boarding stub. "Platform 3. Westbound express leaves at 10:30. Mind your luggage." "Thank you," Edna said, in a voice so steady it surprised even herself. She had one small traveling bag, hastily packed the night before when she had made her decision, containing 2 dresses, her copy of Middlemark, a packet of letters, her teaching certificate from the St. Joseph Normal School, which bore, unfortunately, the name Edna Archer and not Clara Voss, her mother's cameo brooch, and $42 she had saved over 3 years from giving piano lessons to the neighbors' children. She had left everything else behind, including the dress for a wedding she intended never to attend. Platform 3 was crowded in that particular way that westbound platforms always were in 1878, full of people chasing something: land, gold, second chances, or simply distance from whatever they were leaving behind. Edna pressed through the crowd toward the rear of the train, found a seat by the window in the second passenger car, placed her bag on her lap, and looked out at the platform with the expression of someone who was very determinedly not panicking. That was when she first saw him. He was leaning against the far support post of the platform roof with the particular ease of a man who has never once in his life felt the need to hurry. He was tall, considerably tall, with broad shoulders in a worn brown canvas duster, and a hat that had seen better decades pushed back just enough to reveal a face that was angular and sun-darkened, with a jaw that looked carved from the same limestone that built the bluffs along the Missouri River. He carried no visible luggage beyond a single weathered saddlebag slung over one shoulder, and he was watching the crowd with calm, unhurried attention, the way a hawk watches a field from a fence post. Then his eyes moved, unhurried and deliberate, straight to Edna's window. And he held her gaze for just a moment, not in a rude or invasive way, but in the manner of someone who sees exactly what they expected to see, and the corner of his mouth moved the smallest fraction before he looked away. Edna told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she was simply nervous, and nervous women imagined significance in the glances of strangers. She looked back at the platform and gripped her bag a little tighter. When the train whistle screamed and the locomotive lurched forward in a great billow of smoke and steam, Edna Archer exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Kansas City fell away behind her in a smear of brick and smoke, and the wide, flat breadth of Kansas opened ahead like a page of a book not yet written, and she thought, I am free. Whatever comes next, I am free. The man in the brown duster came down the aisle of the second car with his saddlebag over his shoulder and settled into the seat directly across from her with the same unhurried confidence he had displayed on the platform. Up close, he was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two either side of that, with dark eyes the color of old wood and the kind of hands that told a whole biography, calloused, capable, bearing a thin white scar across the back of the right one that looked like it had come from a rope under tension. He set his saddlebag by his feet, removed his hat, and laid it on the empty seat beside him. Then he looked at her directly, with perfect courtesy and something that was almost amusement. Morning, he said. His voice was low and even, with a drawl that placed him somewhere south of the Red River. Good morning, Edna replied, and looked deliberately out the window. There was a brief silence filled with the rhythm of the wheels on the tracks. You comfortable with the window shade, or would you rather I pull it? He asked. Sun's going to be on that side around noon. I am fine as I am, thank you, Edna said. Another silence. She could feel him watching her without looking. You're heading all the way to end of line, he asked. Dodge City. I am getting off before that, she said carefully. Harlo Creek Junction. Is that right? He said it as a statement, not a question, and there was something in his tone that made Edna look at him again. He had a stillness about him that was unusual, not the vacancy of a slow thinker, but the deliberate quiet of someone who had learned that watching and listening were more valuable than speaking. And yourself? She asked, because not asking would have been conspicuous. Same junction, he said simply, and looked out his own window. Edna took a very careful, very controlled breath. Harlo Creek was not a large place by any account she had read. It was a ranching and farming community of perhaps 300 souls, recently enough established that it still had more ambition than permanence. The idea of sharing a destination with this particular stranger produced an unease that she could not entirely rationalize. She unclasped her traveling bag, drew out her copy of Middlemark, and opened it with the decisiveness of someone erecting a polite wall. She read exactly 4 sentences before he spoke again. That's a good book, he said. The part where Dorothea realizes what she's done marrying Casaubon, that's particularly well observed. Edna looked up from her book slowly. You've read George Eliot. I have a lot of time on long rides, he said, without defensiveness or pride, simply as a statement of fact. Name's Jeremiah Langston. He did not offer his hand, which was the correct etiquette when addressing a woman he had not been formally introduced to. He merely offered his name and waited. She hesitated exactly 1 beat too long, the hesitation of someone choosing between 2 names, and said, Clara Voss. Jeremiah Langston looked at her for a moment that stretched just slightly past comfortable, and the same fractional movement appeared at the corner of his mouth. Pleased to meet you, Miss Voss, he said, in the tone of a man who is being entirely truthful and yet also somehow privately entertained. Edna looked back at her book. Her heart was doing something undignified. The Kansas landscape unrolled itself outside the window in its early autumn colors, the tall grass prairie in shades of amber and rust, the occasional creek bed traced by a dark line of cottonwoods, the vast sky beginning to build toward that particular shade of blue that seemed to have no ceiling. Edna had grown up in Missouri and knew the Mississippi as her river, its green and restless banks her childhood geography. This was different. This was open in a way that felt almost confrontational, as though the land were asking you to justify your presence. She found it beautiful, though she was not yet ready to admit that to anyone. The train stopped at a small waypoint called Ellisville around midday, and the passengers were offered 20 minutes to stretch their legs and visit the small station building, which functioned also as a general store. Edna descended the steps carefully, holding her bag, and walked to the far end of the building where a water pump stood beside a wooden trough. She filled the cup chained to the pump and drank deeply, and when she straightened, Jeremiah Langston was leaning against the corner of the building at a respectful distance, buying a paper sack of something from a boy who had materialized with the opportunism that characterized frontier commerce. He walked over without invitation, though he stopped at a perfectly appropriate distance and held out the paper sack. "Dried apricots," he said. "Long afternoon still ahead." Edna stared at the bag, then at him. "That is very kind, but they're not going to bite you," he said with the ghost of a smile. She took the bag. The apricots were sweet and leathery and tasted like preserved sunlight. She ate 3 of them and handed the bag back. "Thank you, Mr. Langston." "Jeremiah's fine," he said, and they stood in the thin noon sunlight while the locomotive hissed and settled and the station master called the 5-minute warning. "What takes you to Harlo Creek?" Edna asked, because conversation was safer than silence when there was too much silence to think in. "I manage a cattle operation out that way," he said. "Langston Quarter Circle spread, about 14 miles east of town. I've been back east for 6 weeks dealing with buyers and a livestock dispute that required lawyers." He said the word lawyers the way most people might say toothache. "You." "Teaching," she said. "The community school." "That's good," he said, and he said it without condescension or the slightly surprised tone that she had learned to expect from men when a woman announced a professional intention. He said it as though it were simply a good thing, and she found herself unexpectedly gratified. "Have you been to Harlo Creek long?" she asked. "For years," he said. "Since '74. I came down from Montana with a small herd and enough capital to be foolish with, and somehow managed not to be entirely foolish with it." He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the pump handle and settled it back on his head. "I'll warn you, the town's decent people for the most part, but it's still finding its feet. Saloons louder than the church on most days, which offends the reverend to no end. Sheriff Tilden is fair but stretched thin, and Mrs. Hathaway, who runs the boarding house, will want to know everything about you within the first hour and will have opinions about most of it." Edna laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her before she could consider whether it was appropriate, and it was a sound she had not made in weeks, possibly months. Jeremiah Langston looked at her when she laughed, and something in his expression changed in a way that was subtle enough that she would not have caught it had she not been watching him as carefully as she was. The 5-minute call came, and they walked back to the train together, which Edna categorized firmly as coincidence of direction and nothing more. The afternoon rolled westward. The conversations they fell into were strange things, starting and stopping, veering from the practical to the surprisingly particular. He knew a great deal about cattle disease and rainfall patterns and the political situation with the railroad land grants, and she knew a great deal about literature and mathematics and the failures of various state educational policies, and somehow these things kept meeting at unexpected angles and becoming interesting. She found herself lowering Middlemark to her lap and eventually putting it away entirely. He told her about the Montana territory he had come from, his father's homestead there, the winters that could kill a man's pride before they killed him outright. She told him carefully, as Clara Voss, about teaching, about the idea of educating frontier children whose schools kept closing because their families kept moving, about the frustration of watching girls in particular steered away from learning as soon as they were old enough to be useful in other capacities. "That's worth being angry about," he said simply. "You're not going to tell me it's simply the way things are?" she asked, and she could hear the edge in her own voice, the waiting for disappointment edge. "The way things are and the way things ought to be are different accounts," he said. I've seen both. No reason to pretend they're the same book." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that made everything look the color of old gold, and the train rocked gently on the rails, and the wide Kansas sky was doing something magnificent with the clouds in the distance. "Mr. Langston," she began. "Jeremiah," he said. "Jeremiah." It felt strange to say, intimate in a way she had not intended. "Have you always been so direct?" "Generally," he said. "Life's shorter than most people plan for. Felt like a waste to beat around things." She absorbed this. There was a philosophical economy to it that she found disarming. They were somewhere west of Hutchinson when the trouble on the train began, and it began the way most trouble in 1878 began, loudly and with whiskey as a contributing factor. Two men in the car ahead had been drinking since Ellisville, and their argument, over something that began as a card game grievance and had spiraled outward in the way alcohol-fueled arguments do, became physical with a suddenness that made several passengers cry out. A conductor appeared, then another, and the commotion resolved itself eventually in the removal of one man to the rear car and a great deal of broken crockery from the refreshment service. But during the 15 minutes of uncertainty, Edna had gripped the arm of her seat, and Jeremiah had stood in the aisle between the cars in a way that was not threatening, but was unmistakably deliberate, positioned between the disturbance and the other passengers with the calm surety of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. When it was over and he sat back down, Edna realized she had been watching him throughout with considerably more attention than the situation required. "You were a lawman," she said. It was not entirely a question. "Deputy briefly," he said, "years ago before the cattle operation. And before that," he looked at her with that quality of quiet attention, "before that, a war I would rather not discuss in pleasant company." She understood. Many men of his approximate age carried that particular door closed inside them. The door marked 1861 to 1865, and she had learned it was graceless to knock on it. "Your family," she said instead, "are they in Harlo Creek?" Something shifted in his face very briefly. "My mother's in Texas. My father died in 71. I have a younger brother, Thomas, who runs part of the operation with me." He paused. "You," Edna considered this. The safest answer was the closest to true. "My parents are gone," she said, and that much was real. Her father had died when she was 9, her mother when she was 17, which was what had deposited her in her uncle's house in the first place. "I have an uncle in Kansas City." "Is he the reason you left?" Jeremiah asked, and he said it with such directness and without judgment that the question landed in a strange, tender place. "No," she said after a moment. "The reason I left is it's complicated." "Most good reasons are," he said, and left it there, which was perhaps the most considerate thing he could have done. The sun was tilting toward the horizon when the train finally pulled into the small junction platform marked Harlow Creek, 2 painted words on a wooden sign above a small stone building. There were perhaps a dozen people on the platform to meet the train. A woman with 2 children, a man in a minister's collar, an elderly fellow with a cart for freight, and 3 cowboys who had ridden in for supplies and were watching the train with the interested attention that frontier people gave to any arrival from the east. And there was a woman Edna did not know but immediately identified by instinct as Mrs. Hathaway, compact, 60s, with the posture of a retired sergeant and eyes that assessed things with alarming speed. Edna descended the steps and stood on the Harlo Creek platform in the last warmth of the September afternoon, and felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of having arrived somewhere that was simultaneously completely real and completely new. Jeremiah came down behind her, saddlebag over his shoulder, and she heard the sharp intake of recognition from several people on the platform. Jeremiah called one of the cowboys, a young man of perhaps 20 with a great deal of energy in his grin. "You're back. Thomas said you'd be on this train." "I said I would be," Jeremiah replied, and there was warmth in his voice that she had not quite heard before, the warmth of a man at home. He shook hands, exchanged a few words, and then turned, and he found her eye through the small crowd with the ease of someone who had not lost track of her for a moment. Mrs. Hathaway materialized at Edna's elbow with terrifying swiftness. "Miss Voss, Miss Clara Voss for the teaching position." Edna turned to her. "Yes," she said, "that's me." "Excellent. I'm Constance Hathaway. The church committee arranged your room at my boarding house. I'm afraid it's nothing grand, but it's clean and the meals are hot. I'll need to know your preference for breakfast." She paused for exactly no time at all. "And you've met Jeremiah Langston, I see. He's the most reliable man in the county, which the county sorely needs more of." "We shared a car on the train," Edna said carefully. Jeremiah, who had arrived at her other side, touched the brim of his hat to Mrs. Hathaway. "Constance, looking formidable as ever." "I always look formidable," Mrs. Hathaway said with evident satisfaction. "Are you coming to Sunday's social, or am I going to have to send Thomas to drag you out of those pastures?" "I'll be there," he said, and he glanced at Edna. "Miss Voss will be getting settled. She'll want to see the schoolhouse when she's ready. I can show her around the town when she's had time to breathe, if that's agreeable." It was directed at Edna and also at Mrs. Hathaway simultaneously, which was deft, and the older woman nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has just witnessed a thing she approves of. Edna said it was agreeable. She was not entirely sure she meant it to sound as warm as it did. The boarding house was on the main street of Harlo Creek, a two-story frame building painted white, and Mrs. Hathaway's other lodgers at present were a land surveyor named Mr. Prentice and a young widow named Ellen Corby, who had come west with her late husband and had elected to remain after his passing from fever the previous spring, now working at the dry goods store. Both of them were at supper when Edna arrived, and the meal roast pork, biscuits, dried bean soup, and a pie that contained more pride than fruit was exactly what 6 hours on a train required. That night, in her small room on the second floor with its iron-frame bed and its window that looked out over the main street, Edna sat on the edge of the mattress in her nightgown and held her teaching certificate in her hands and stared at her own name printed on it. Edna Archer. Certified to teach in the state of Missouri, 1876. Not Clara Voss, not anyone else. She had known when she boarded the train that she would have to address this eventually. She had simply not wanted to address it yet, not while she was still in motion, not while the escape was still warm in her blood. But Harlo Creek was not a motion. Harlo Creek was a place, a real place, and she would have to teach in its schoolhouse and live in its boarding house and exist among its 300 people. And eventually someone would see her certificate, or the church organization would correspond with Clara directly and receive a confused reply about a broken collarbone, or any one of a dozen other threads she had pulled would unravel. She folded the certificate carefully and put it at the bottom of her bag beneath her mother's cameo brooch. She would think about it tomorrow. She would think about what was honest and what was possible, and what, if anything, could be salvaged from the situation she had put herself in. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass somewhere beyond the edge of town, a sound she had never heard before and which was, unexpectedly, the most soothing thing she had encountered in months. The next morning she woke to bright early light and the sound of Mrs. Hathaway moving around the kitchen below with the efficiency of a small factory, and she dressed in her better traveling dress, the blue one with the small buttons, and came downstairs to find a letter on the table at her place. It was addressed to Miss Clara Voss, care of the Harlo Creek Community Church Education Committee, and it was written on the stationery of the Kansas Board of Education, and it informed Clara, that the committee was delighted to confirm the teaching appointment, that the schoolhouse required some minor repairs before term began in 2 weeks, and that the salary would be paid monthly at $12, which was not a fortune but was independence. $12 a month. Independence. Edna set the letter down and pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed. "Jeremiah Langston is outside, Mrs. Hathaway announced from the kitchen doorway, with the casual delivery of someone who has observed something interesting. "He says he'll be happy to show you the schoolhouse when you've eaten, if you'd like. His brother Thomas has gone back to the ranch, so he's in town for the morning." Edna ate her eggs and biscuit and drank 2 cups of very strong coffee and told herself that she was going to the schoolhouse because she needed to see it. And the fact that Jeremiah Langston was the one offering to show her was entirely incidental. He was indeed outside, standing with his horse, a large, well-maintained bay that regarded Edna with the dignified disinterest of an animal that has long since assessed humanity and withheld its full approval. Jeremiah was not on the horse. He was standing beside it, speaking to a man in a leather apron, the blacksmith, she would later learn, and when he saw her come through the door, he concluded the conversation and turned toward her with that same unhurried quality that she was beginning to realize was not laziness but something closer to its opposite. A man so certain of himself that he had no need to perform urgency. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied. "You don't have to do this, you know." "I'm aware," he said. "The schoolhouse is 4 blocks over and behind the church. It'll take about 6 minutes to walk there, and I was heading past it anyway. It's not a sacrifice." They walked. The town in the morning was a different creature than the town that had greeted her the previous afternoon, more workmanlike, less self-conscious. Horses stood at hitching posts outside the general store. The sound of hammering came from somewhere. A woman hung washing on a line between 2 houses. The air was clean and cool, and carried the smell of prairie and, faintly, of cattle. Jeremiah pointed things out as they walked without making it feel like a tour: the post office, which doubled as a telegraph station; the physician's office, which was also the dentist's office; the small wooden structure that served as a bank; the reverend's house beside the church, which was itself a modest and hopeful building. The schoolhouse was behind the church, as promised, and it was a single-room frame building with 6 rows of wooden benches and a cast-iron stove in the corner, and a blackboard that had seen better days and a window that was missing a pane and had been temporarily covered with oilskin. It smelled of chalk and old wood, and that peculiar scent of enclosed space that all schoolrooms share across all eras. Edna walked in and stood in the center of it and turned a full, slow circle. She had wanted to teach since she was 14 years old, since a teacher named Miss Paris in St. Joseph had told her that she had the rarest of educational gifts, which was the ability to make a complicated thing feel like someone had simply opened a door they had always had the key to. She had gone to the normal school, taken her certificate, and then her uncle had had opinions about women who taught in schools rather than managing households, and Harold Briggs had appeared on the scene, and somewhere in the intervening years the possibility of a classroom like this one had receded like water in a dry summer. Standing here now, in this small imperfect room in this small frontier town, she felt something rearrange itself in her chest. "What are you thinking?" Jeremiah asked from the doorway. He had not come in. He was leaning in the frame, giving her the room. "That the window needs replacing before October," she said. "And that I need to know what the students have already been taught and what materials are available." And she stopped, and he prompted. "That I very much want this," she said, and the simplicity of it surprised her. He said nothing for a moment. Then it's yours, you earned it," she almost told him. She stood in the thin morning light of that small schoolhouse and she almost said, "My name is not Clara Voss, it is Edna Archer, and I came here on a stolen ticket, and I am afraid that everything I want here will be taken from me when the truth catches up with me, as it always does." But she did not. Because she was not ready, and because she was afraid, and because the truth is a heavy thing to hand to someone who is still mostly a stranger, no matter how strangely familiar he feels. "Thank you," she said instead, and they walked back through the morning town, and she made herself focus on the practical matters. What lumber would be needed for the schoolhouse repairs, whether the church committee would authorize the expenditure, how quickly she could source a replacement pane for the window. 2 weeks passed, with the particular density of weeks that matter. Edna threw herself into the schoolhouse preparations with an energy that impressed the church committee, charmed the reverend's wife, and exhausted herself in the most satisfying way possible. She sourced the window glass from the general store. She had the benches sanded and 2 of them replaced. She made a list of the students who would be coming, 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 15, and obtained from Mrs. Hathaway and from Ellen Corby detailed accounts of which families they came from and what their particular circumstances were. She saw Jeremiah Langston 4 times in those 2 weeks, which was not a large number but which somehow managed to feel significant. Once at the general store, where he was ordering fence wire and she was ordering chalk, and they had a 7-minute conversation about the town council's decision regarding a proposed additional water supply. Once at the Sunday social, where he did not dance. I have a philosophical objection to making a public spectacle of my own awkwardness, he told her, but stood at the edge of the floor and watched, and occasionally said something dry and accurate about the proceedings that made her laugh. Once at the schoolhouse itself, when she had not expected him, he had arrived with Thomas, his younger brother, a cheerful and straightforward young man of 26 who had clearly hero-worshipped Jeremiah since childhood, to offer their labor in mending the schoolhouse fence. And once in the evening, by pure accident, when she had walked to the edge of town at dusk to see the prairie in the last of the light, and found him there already, sitting on a fence rail looking west, and they had talked for an hour about nothing consequential and everything important, and she had walked back to the boarding house in the dark feeling something warm and alarmed in equal measure. The thing she was beginning to understand about Jeremiah Langston, the thing that was most dangerously appealing, was that he listened to her. Not in the way that polite men listen, with the slight forward lean that conceals their impatience for their own turn to speak, but with genuine attention, the kind that asked questions and remembered the answers and connected them to things said 2 conversations ago. He treated her opinions as though they were worth considering. He disagreed with her occasionally about the railroad's influence on the small rancher, about whether the frontier schooling model was preferable to the Eastern Academy system, and disagreed directly and without condescension, as though the disagreement itself were interesting to him. It was a new experience. She had not realized how hungry she had been for it, but the lie sat between them like a stone she could not see and kept tripping over in the dark. Mrs. Hathaway, who was perceptive in the manner of someone who has been watching human beings for many decades and has catalogued their patterns, came to Edna's room on the evening before school was to begin and sat in the single chair by the window while Edna sorted books on the dresser and said, in her direct way, "You seem like a woman who's made a difficult decision." Edna set down her book. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's made a few of her own," Mrs. Hathaway said. "I'm not asking you to account for yourself. I'm just saying, this town's got a short memory for the past and a long one for character. It's who you are here that'll matter." Edna thought about this for a long time after Mrs. Hathaway left. Who you are here. Not who you came here being, not what name you arrived under. Who you are here in the doing of it. It was a comforting philosophy and also, she suspected, a slightly optimistic one, but she held it carefully overnight. The first day of school was a Wednesday in early October, and the 23 students arrived with the full range of enthusiasm that frontier children brought to most things. Some eager, some wary, some deeply skeptical of the entire enterprise, and one boy of 11 named Caleb Sutherland who arrived with a frog in his jacket pocket, and a preparedness to deploy it that Edna identified and disarmed in the first 4 minutes of the morning. She discovered, standing at the front of that small room with its new window pane and its sanded benches, that Miss Paris from St. Joseph had been right. She was good at this. She was genuinely, uncomplicatedly good at it in the way that some people are good at things that feel like they were made for them. She could feel the room feel where attention was flagging, where confusion was setting in, where a different approach was needed. The way a rider feels a horse through the reins. She walked home at the end of the first day feeling more purely herself than she had in years. And that feeling, that sense of rightness, made the lie sharper and more uncomfortable than ever. Because you cannot be fully yourself while wearing someone else's name. It was on the fourth day of school that the letter arrived. It came through the church committee, forwarded from the Kansas Board of Education, and it was addressed to the Harlo Creek Community Church in care of the committee chairwoman, a stout and sensible woman named Mrs. Elliston, and it was from the real Clara Voss. Edna did not know about the letter until the following Sunday, when Mrs. Elliston appeared at the boarding house door with an expression that balanced concern and embarrassment in roughly equal parts, and asked if she might speak with Miss Voss privately. Edna sat in Mrs. Hathaway's parlor with her hands folded in her lap, and listened to Mrs. Elliston explain that they had received a letter from a young woman in St. Joseph who identified herself as Clara Voss, who said she had been injured and unable to travel, and who was writing to apologize for her delay and to inquire as to whether the position might be held for her for another month. The silence in the parlor was very complete. "I see," Edna said. "So you are not Mrs. Elliston," began carefully. "No," Edna said. "I am not Clara Voss. My name is Edna Archer." She said her own name and felt the relief of it, the strange uncoiling of a muscle she had kept tensed for weeks. "I used Miss Voss's ticket with her knowledge and consent." That second part was not entirely true, but it was the version that protected Clara from any wrongdoing which Edna owed her. "I have my own teaching certificate from the St. Joseph Normal School. I am qualified for this position. I understand if the committee wishes to remove me." Mrs. Elliston looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. "Why do it this way?" Edna took a breath. "Because I was running from a situation that gave me no legitimate route out, and this was the route I had." She paused. "I understand that is not an excuse." Mrs. Elliston was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, "I'll need to put this before the full committee. They'll meet Thursday evening." She looked at Edna with something complicated in her expression, not exactly sympathy, but not the absence of it either. "In the meantime, the children have school tomorrow." "Yes," Edna said, "they do." "Then be there," Mrs. Elliston said and stood up. "We'll speak Thursday." The committee met on Thursday evening in the back room of the church, and Edna was not present for it, but Mrs. Hathaway was. She was on the committee, which Edna had not known, and when she came home at 9 in the evening she found Edna sitting in the kitchen with cold coffee and said simply, "You have a provisional 6-month continuation, after which they'll review." Mrs. Elliston argued your case. She said the children are learning. She sat down across from Edna. "You'll need to write to the real Miss Voss and make things right there." "I will," Edna said. "I already have." "Good." Mrs. Hathaway looked at her steadily. "And there's the matter of Jeremiah Langston." Edna looked up. "What matter?" "He came to me yesterday," Mrs. Hathaway said, with the directness that was her primary characteristic. "Asked me privately if the woman who came on the Western train and called herself Clara Voss was in fact who she said she was." She paused. "He wanted to know if you were safe." Edna felt something turn over in her chest. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought you were one of the most capable women I had seen come through this town, and that he should ask you himself." The next morning, a Friday, when the students arrived for their last school day of the week, Edna saw Jeremiah's horse at the hitching post outside the general store across from the schoolhouse. She saw him through the window during the arithmetic lesson, standing in the street, talking to the blacksmith again, and she thought, "He knows." He has known, or suspected, or been in the process of knowing for some time, and he has been waiting. After school, she told the students to go directly home and not to dawdle near the creek, which was a predictive instruction based on her knowledge of Caleb Sutherland's relationship with bodies of water, and she tidied the schoolhouse and put on her coat and walked across the street. Jeremiah was still there. He was sitting on the bench outside the store with his hat on his knee, as though he had been prepared to wait considerably longer. He looked up when she crossed the street, and he rose from the bench with the automatic courtesy that she had noticed was simply part of him. "I owe you an honest conversation," she said before he could speak. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But I'll take it if you're offering." They walked to the edge of town, to the fence rail where they had talked at dusk 3 weeks ago. The prairie was doing something magnificent in the October afternoon, golden and enormous, the grass moving in long, slow waves. A hawk was doing serious business very high up, and the sky was the particular depthless blue of the inland west. Edna told him everything. She told him about her uncle and about Harold Briggs, and about the wedding dress she had left hanging and the piano students and the $42 and the ticket with Clara's name on it. She told him about the station master who barely looked up and the lie that had settled over her like a second skin, and how strange and right it had felt to say her real name to Mrs. Elliston in the parlor. She told him her name was Edna Archer, and she had come west on a borrowed identity, and she was terrified and grateful in roughly equal and indistinguishable parts. He listened. He listened the way he always listened, without performing the act of listening, simply being present and attentive, his dark eyes on her face, his hands quiet. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Clara Voss," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "I knew that wasn't your name." On the platform, when you introduced yourself, you hesitated half a beat too long, like you were choosing between two words. Edna stared at him. "You knew." "I suspected," he said. "I didn't know your real name. I knew the name you gave wasn't the one you were born to." He looked out at the prairie. "I figured you had a reason, figured you'd tell me when you were ready." "And if I hadn't?" she asked. He considered this with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "I'd have waited longer," he said. "People tell the truth when they trust the person they're telling it to. That's not something you can rush." The hawk completed some aerial transaction in the high air above and banked south. The grass moved and moved and moved. "Jeremiah," Edna said. "Edna," he said, and the way he said her real name, her actual name, deliberate and unhurried, did something to the air around them that she could not have described accurately. "How long did you know?" she managed. "Since the train," he said. "I asked around when we got here. Mrs. Hathaway told me about the real Clara Voss being injured. I put it together." "And you didn't tell anyone?" "It wasn't mine to tell," he said simply. She looked at him for a long time. He met her eyes with the same steady openness that was characteristic of him, without agenda or performance, simply himself being present in the world. "I'm not a dishonest person," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know that," he said. "Dishonest people don't look the way you look when you tell the truth." He paused. "They also don't spend 2 weeks fixing up a schoolhouse with that particular quality of attention." She laughed again, surprised by it again, and he smiled, a real smile this time, not the fractional movement she had catalogued on the train, but a genuine and somewhat illuminating thing that rearranged his face entirely. "Edna Archer," he said again, as though he were testing the sound of it. "That suits you better, does it? Clara Voss is a perfectly good name," he said. "But Edna Archer sounds like someone who makes her own way." She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to make your own way, about the cost of it and the shape of it, and whether the making of it required a specific destination or whether the making was the thing itself. "Jeremiah," she said, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right," he said. "Are you going to hold this against me? The deception?" She gestured vaguely at the complicated architecture of her past month. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of hesitation, but the quiet of a man who takes questions seriously and means to answer them correctly. "No," he said. "You were in a situation that gave you no good options and you took the only one you had. That's not a character flaw, that's resourcefulness under pressure." He looked at her. "What I might hold against you eventually is if you started being dishonest with me from here." "I won't," she said, and she meant it with a completeness she had rarely felt about anything. "Then we're settled," he said. They were not entirely settled, of course. There is no moment of complete settlement between two people who are falling in love, only the progressive closing of gaps, the slow and occasionally startling recognition of what is actually happening. But they stood at that fence rail in the October prairie and watched the hawk and the grass and the enormous sky. and something between them that had been held at careful distance began, very quietly, to approach. The weeks that followed had the quality of something being built carefully, with good materials, without rush. Edna settled into her name and her work with equal commitment. The students, who had initially treated her with the assessment that frontier children extend to all newcomers, came around in the particular way that children do with teachers who are genuinely interested in them. Not with the sudden theatrical transformation of a story, but through the accumulation of small moments. The day she helped Caleb Sutherland understand long division using a system involving horses and fence posts that made the whole thing click into place. The afternoon she convinced a painfully shy girl of 8 named Anna Reeves to read aloud by letting her first whisper the passage to Edna alone, then in a smaller voice to 2 students, then, slowly, over 2 weeks to the whole room. The day she brought in her copy of Middlemarch and read the opening pages to the oldest students, who had expected to be bored and weren't. She wrote to Clara Voss, a long, honest letter that apologized and explained and enclosed $3 toward any trouble caused, which was a significant portion of what she could spare, and which Clara wrote back to forgive with characteristic generosity and a postscript that read, "Edna Archer, you always were the brave one. I hope it is everything you needed it to be." She kept that letter in the pocket of her blue dress for several weeks. Jeremiah came to town on most Saturdays for supplies, and it became a natural thing, not arranged, not performed, simply natural, that he would stop at the boarding house or cross paths with Edna on the main street, and they would talk. Sometimes briefly, sometimes for long stretches that ended with both of them surprised by how the time had passed. He was not a man who made declarations. He was a man who showed up consistently and paid attention, and offered the specific kind of presence that is harder to find than any declaration. He remembered things she had mentioned in passing and asked about them. He brought her a book from the general store's small lending shelf one Saturday, a collection of American poetry, and handed it over with the brevity of someone who is not comfortable making grand gestures but has made a small and deliberate one. "You mentioned Emily Dickinson," he said. "I don't know if there's any of hers in there, but there might be." There was. Several poems. She read them that night with a feeling in her chest that was warm and a little frightening. November arrived with its particular serious cold, the kind that arrived on the plains without the softening that trees provided in the east, coming instead with a directness that was either invigorating or simply cold, depending on the day. The children came to school in heavier coats. The stove worked overtime. Edna learned the specific art of keeping a cast-iron stove functional, and even in a drafty room, which was a skill that required more attention and nuance than she had anticipated. On the second Saturday of November, she was walking back from the general store with a packet of candles and a small sack of cornmeal. She had been contributing to the boarding house kitchen now, in lieu of a portion of her rent, when she saw Jeremiah's horse outside the sheriff's office rather than outside the store, which was unusual. She thought about it as she walked, and then thought, "It's not your concern." But when she passed the door of the sheriff's office, it was open, and she could hear voices inside, and one of them was raised in a way that snagged her attention. She stopped. "Not a matter for the county," Jeremiah's voice, controlled but with something underneath it. "The water rights on that eastern pasture were deeded to my father in '72, and the deed was properly recorded." A voice she did not recognize, sharper, with a flat quality that sounded like someone accustomed to using words as leverage. "Records get complicated, Langston. The territory's expanding and there are competing claims." "There are no competing claims," Jeremiah said, with a precision that was cutting. "There is one legally recorded deed, and there is a man with political connections attempting to use those connections to displace it. That distinction matters." Edna walked on. She mentioned nothing at dinner, but that evening Mrs. Hathaway, who knew everything, explained that a man named Walcott, a land speculator who had arrived in the territory 6 months ago with the backing of an Eastern investment group and considerable political muscle, had been quietly maneuvering against several of the established small ranchers in the area, challenging land titles, redirecting water access arguments to favorable courts, and generally deploying the mechanisms of legal paperwork and political influence in ways that the ranchers who had built their operations with labor and time were poorly positioned to counter. Jeremiah's quarter circle spread was one of the operations Walcott had identified. The water rights dispute was the current front in what appeared to be a broader campaign. Edna thought about this for several days. On the following Tuesday, she spent her lunch hour in the land record's office, which was a small room off the county courthouse that doubled as a storage room for farming equipment, and read the recorded deed to the quarter circle water rights, which was exactly as Jeremiah had described it, and then she read the challenge that had been filed against it, which was worded in the specific vocabulary of legal misdirection. Not lying exactly, but assembling fragments of truth into a misleading architecture. She had grown up in a house where her uncle, a moderately prosperous man, had taught her without intending to that property and power were related in ways that simple honesty did not resolve. She had learned to read contracts before she could vote, which was to say, she had learned to read them and had no mechanism to act on what she read, and she knew what she was looking at. She went to find Jeremiah. He was at the livery stable, seeing to his horse before the ride back to the ranch, and when she walked in with her notes and her careful face, he turned and read her expression with the accuracy she had come to expect. "You've been in the records office," he said. "I have," she said. "And I think I found something." She showed him her notes. The challenge to the water rights was based on a territorial boundary revision that had indeed occurred in 1876, but the revision had explicitly grandfathered existing deeded rights, a clause that was contained in the revision document itself but had been omitted from the challenge filing, not through oversight but through deliberate selection. Jeremiah looked at her notes for a long time. Then he looked at her. "How did you know to look for this?" he asked. "I grew up watching my uncle manage properties," she said. "He was not always scrupulous about what he included in his filings and what he left out. I learned to read the gaps." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Edna," he said her name with a weight that was different from the way he usually said it, not less warm but more careful, as though he were handling something of value. "Thank you. It's not resolved yet," she said. "You'll need this in front of a judge who isn't in Walcott's pocket." "Sheriff Tilden knows a circuit judge in Wichita," he said. "I'll send a telegram today." "Good," she said. He looked at her for another moment. She was aware of the smell of hay and horse and leather and cold air, and of the fact that they were standing closer together than they usually stood, and of a feeling in her chest that was warm and urgent and had nowhere particular to go except to continue being felt. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He reached out and very briefly, very carefully covered her hand with his, the hand holding her notes, for just a moment. It was not a declaration. It was something quieter and more real than a declaration. She held it in her memory for a long time afterward. The circuit judge arrived in Harlo Creek 3 weeks later, and the hearing on the water rights was held in the back room of the courthouse, which was a slightly larger and less storage-oriented space than the records office. Edna was not at the hearing, she had school, but Thomas Langston appeared at the schoolhouse door at noon to tell her that the judge had ruled in their favor, citing the grandfathering clause exactly as she had identified it. Walcott did not disappear from the territory, because men with capital and political backing rarely simply disappear, but his immediate campaign against the quarter circle was checked, and checked conclusively. He turned his attention elsewhere, and Jeremiah had time to address his fences and his cattle and his ordinary operation. December came. The schoolhouse was warm enough now that Edna had established a routine of leaving the stove banked overnight so it could be stoked up quickly in the morning, and the students had settled into their rhythms and their personalities, and she knew them now. She knew Caleb Sutherland's genius for mechanical thinking that was wasted in arithmetic but flowering in geometry. She knew Anna Reeves's imagination, which had begun to produce small stories that Edna encouraged with careful praise. She knew the 3 Ortega siblings who rode 4 miles each morning on a single horse, and whose facility for language was remarkable in ways their parents did not know yet. She was, in the clearest and most complete sense, where she was supposed to be. And Jeremiah Langston was. She was no longer pretending she did not know what he was to her. He was the person whose arrival on the main street she registered before she was consciously aware of looking for him. He was the person whose voice she recognized before she identified his face. He was the person whose opinion she wanted and whose silences she was comfortable in, and whose presence was somehow both calming and the opposite of calming. She knew that he felt the same. She was not yet certain what either of them was going to do about it. On the last Saturday before Christmas, when half the town turned out for the church community gathering that involved carols and a great deal of Mrs. Hathaway's gingerbread, Jeremiah arrived from the ranch with Thomas, and they were both swept immediately into the social current of the evening. Edna was with Ellen Corby near the punch table, and Ellen was saying something about a letter from her sister in Ohio, and Edna was listening, and also watching Jeremiah across the room without being entirely intentional about it. He caught her eye. He nodded, a small, private acknowledgement that was just for her, and she looked away and felt warmth move up the back of her neck, and told herself firmly to attend to what Ellen was saying. Later, the carols were sung with the particular passion of people who are otherwise separated by great distances of prairie, and who find in communal singing a connection they do not often get to experience. Edna sang. She had a good voice, a choir-trained voice from her years at the church in St. Joseph, and she was aware at some point during "O Holy Night" that Jeremiah had positioned himself near enough that she could have turned and found him immediately. When the gathering began to thin, he appeared at her side with the unhurried inevitability that was his primary characteristic. "Walk with me?" he asked. They walked out into the cold December dark, which was the particular dark of the plains, enormous and populated by an excess of stars. The cold was immediate and sharp, and Edna pulled her coat tighter. Their breath made small clouds in the air between them. They walked to the edge of town without particular direction, and the stars were extraordinary above the flat horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote said something to the dark and received no immediate answer. "I need to ask you something," Jeremiah said. She waited. "The situation you left in Kansas City," he said carefully. "The man you were supposed to marry." "Harold Briggs," she said. The name tasted like nothing now, like the name of a stranger who had briefly occupied the edge of her life and stepped back. "Is that resolved?" "My uncle knows I left," she said. "I wrote to him in October. He was not pleased." She paused. "There was no formal engagement. I refused to formalize it. I was being pressured toward it, but the pressure was social and economic, not legal. Harold Briggs has moved on. My uncle has made his displeasure clear and then, I believe, also moved on." "You have no legal entanglement." "None," she said. "I am simply a woman with a teaching certificate and a provisional 6-month appointment in Harlo Creek, Kansas." "A woman named Edna Archer," he said. "A woman named Edna Archer," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. Then he turned to face her, and in the darkness she could see the clean lines of his face and the serious, unhurried quality of his expression. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If that's something you'd want." She looked at him. She looked at this man who had known her real name before she gave it to him, who had given her time when she needed time, who had listened with his whole attention and disagreed with respect and shown up consistently and protected her history without claiming it. "Yes," she said, "that is very much something I'd want." He nodded once, with the gravity of someone making a commitment. And then he did the thing she did not expect, which was that he held out his gloved hand and she took it. and they stood there in the enormous December dark of the Kansas plains with the stars overhead, and the coyote having given up on its conversation. And it was one of the simplest and most complete moments she had ever experienced. They walked back to the boarding house holding hands, which was technically improper by the standards of the day and entirely proper by every standard that mattered. Courting in a frontier town in the late 1870s had a particular character shaped by proximity and practicality. There were no theaters in Harlo Creek, no concert halls, no fashionable promenades. What there was, Sunday services and the fellowship afterward, which provided a legitimate public context. The Saturday afternoon when the weather was fine enough to walk. The shared meals at Mrs. Hathaway's table, where Jeremiah now appeared for Sunday dinner with the regularity that everyone in the house had noted, and no one had commented upon directly except Mrs. Hathaway herself, who had said simply, "You'll want the chair on the left. It's more comfortable, and the window lights better for conversation." There was also the particular frontier version of a Sunday ride, borrowed horses for Edna, since she did not own one, and the wide prairie with its 1,000 colors of winter grass and its vertiginous sky, and its absolute silence except for wind. Jeremiah taught her the names of the plants and the hawks and the particular geology of the creek beds, and she taught him with less formality, simply in the natural course of their conversations, things she had read or thought about that he had not encountered, and there was something deeply satisfying about the exchange. The way two people's knowledge can fit together, the way two pieces of terrain join. He took her to the Quarter Circle Ranch on one January afternoon when the weather gave a brief respite from the cold. It was a working ranch of the specific, functional beauty that belonging and labor produce. The long, low ranch house with its wide porch, the working barn, the smaller cabin where Thomas lived, the corrals and the well and the big sky that was the same sky as everywhere but somehow looked owned here, looked answered. She stood on the porch of the ranch house in the winter afternoon and looked out at the land and thought, someone built this. Someone came to this empty place and made a home here from persistence and time. Jeremiah stood beside her and did not say anything because he was not a man who narrated his own meaning, and he did not need to. "It's beautiful," she said. "It needs a woman's attention in the house," he said, and then he looked at her sideways with a quality she was learning was his version of amusement. "That's not, I meant that without the implication you're probably assigning to it." "What implication was I assigning to it?" she said, with the quality of amusement he was learning was hers. "The implication that I was being presumptuous," he said. "Which I was slightly, I'm aware." She laughed, he smiled. They stood on the porch of the Quarter Circle Ranch in the January cold, and the land stretched out around them in its winter colors, and she thought, yes, I think so. Yes. February brought a snowstorm of the kind that the Kansas plains produced with a fury that residents of more wooded territories found difficult to imagine, a great horizontal wall of white that closed everything down for 3 days. The students were kept home. Mrs. Hathaway's boarding house became a warm island of cooking smells and conversation, and Ellen Corby and the land surveyor Mr. Prentice played cards with increasing expertise and increasing inability to pretend they were not fond of each other, and Edna wrote letters and read and mended things by the lamp. On the second day of the storm, Jeremiah arrived. He arrived on foot, having ridden to the edge of town and left his horse at the livery, and he arrived with his coat entirely white and his hat unrecognizable, and he stood at the door and Mrs. Hathaway let him in without comment and fed him soup, and then he and Edna sat by the parlor fire for 4 hours and talked, and it was in those 4 hours, with the storm erasing the world outside the window and the fire doing its ancient domestic work, that the last careful distance between them closed. He told her about the war. He did not say much. He was not a man who made suffering into a performance, but he told her enough. He had been 17 when it started, which meant he had been barely too young to serve at the outset and not too young by the second year. He had seen things that he described only in the vaguest outline, but the outline was enough. He had come back changed, which was simply what the war did, and he had spent years building the quarter circle in the specific way that men who have seen too much of destruction build things deliberately, stone by stone, with the knowledge that it can be lost. She told him about her mother, about the woman who had read to her every evening of her childhood, and who had taught her that knowledge was the one thing that could not be taken by other people's circumstances, and who had died of a fever when Edna was 17, and left her in a world that had opinions about what 17-year-old girls without parents were for. About the years in her uncle's house, where she had learned to be invisible enough to continue reading and studying, and taking her piano money and keeping it safe. They talked until the fire needed feeding and the storm was still going, and then she looked at him across the small distance of the fire and thought about things she did not say yet because the time was not yet exactly right, and he looked back at her with his dark eyes and the same careful attention, and she understood that he was also not saying the thing yet. But it was there. It was entirely there. March arrived and the schoolhouse entered its most productive stretch. The students who had been uncertain in October were now reading. The ones who could read were reading further, and Anna Reeves had written a story of 4 pages that Edna was going to keep because it was extraordinary, and because she wanted to be able to say, someday, that she had recognized it early. Caleb Sutherland had designed a water distribution system for the school's garden plot on the back of his arithmetic paper, and it was better than the system currently used. The church committee met and voted 4-1 to confirm Edna's appointment on a permanent basis, under her real name, which was now on file with the Kansas Board of Education. The dissenting vote had been cast by a Mrs. Fulton who had opinions about women who arrived under false pretenses, and who was outvoted by women who had opinions about women who fixed broken window panes and taught frontier children to read. Edna received the letter confirming the appointment on a Thursday and went directly to the ranch to tell Jeremiah, which was perhaps a measure of how things had changed. Thomas opened the door, informed her that Jeremiah was in the south field, and said with the cheerfulness of a younger brother who has been observing a situation develop with growing satisfaction that she could go on out, and he would put the kettle on for when they came back. She found Jeremiah in the south field, mending a section of fence that the winter had pushed out of alignment. He was working without his coat in the early March warmth, and he looked up when she approached with the attention that had been one of the first things she noticed about him. She told him about the appointment. He set down his fencing tool and looked at her with an expression that was, for him, quite openly warm. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right. I wanted to tell you," she said. "I'm glad you did," he said. They stood in the south field of the quarter circle ranch in the first real warmth of March, with the fence half mended and the cattle grazing at a respectful distance, and the sky doing what it always did, enormous and blue and without apology. And Jeremiah Langston looked at Edna Archer with an expression that was, without any fractional quality or reservation, direct. "I love you," he said. "I have been working up to saying that for approximately 4 months, and I am going to say it now before I find another reason to wait." She looked at him. She looked at this man who had known her real name before she spoke it, who had read her hesitation on a platform in Kansas City and chosen to give her time, who had stood in a train car aisle between danger and the other passengers with quiet deliberateness, who had listened and read Emily Dickinson, and covered her hand with his in a livery stable and taken her seriously from the first conversation. "I love you," she said. "I have been working up to saying that since somewhere around the second day on the train, when you disagreed with me about the railroad land grants and did it as though my opinion mattered, which is apparently all it takes." He laughed. She had made him laugh genuinely and completely, the full sound of it, unguarded, and it was one of the finest sounds she had heard in her life. He kissed her, in the south field in the March sun, with the cattle and the mended fence and the enormous sky. It was not a tentative kiss, but it was not a rushed one either. It was the kiss of someone who has been patient and is now being direct, which was, she thought, entirely consistent with everything she knew about him. Thomas had, in fact, made the kettle on, and they went back to the ranch house and drank tea in the kitchen, and Thomas made no comment on the fact that they were sitting rather close together, which was its own form of comment. They were married in June of 1879, on a Saturday, in the Harlo Creek Church with its modest ambitions, and its good timber floors and its windows, through which the Kansas light poured in the specific golden abundance of early summer. Mrs. Hathaway sat in the front pew with a handkerchief she claimed was merely precautionary. Thomas Langston was best man, and did his duties with a grin that threatened to split his face in two. Ellen Corby was one of Edna's attendants, alongside Anna Reeves's mother, who had become a friend in the way that frontier communities cultivate friendships, quickly, with a directness that might seem abrupt elsewhere. Reverend Alcott conducted the ceremony with the enthusiasm of a man who believes strongly in the institution and has seen enough of the alternative. He asked if anyone had objection to the union in the traditional manner, and there was a silence that contained no objections and a great deal of goodwill. Jeremiah said his vows with the precise seriousness that was characteristic of him, looking at Edna with the same direct attention he had leveled at her on the platform in Kansas City, when she was still calling herself someone else. Edna said hers with a conviction that surprised her with its depth. She had not expected a vow to feel like this, like a thing that was already true and was simply being spoken into the public air. The reception was held in the church grounds, which meant tables brought out from several houses, and enough food to represent the contributions of approximately 40 families, and a fiddle player named McGillies who had opinions about the precise tempo at which a reel should be played and would not be argued with. Dancing happened. Jeremiah danced with her twice and was considerably better at it than his philosophical objection had suggested. She caught Mrs. Hathaway wiping her eyes at one point and did not mention it, which was the graceful thing to do. They went to the ranch that evening as the June sun set over the prairie in colors that belonged to a different scale of artistry than human hands could manage, all orange and deep rose, and the particular blue that followed. And the ranch house, her home now, with its wide porch and its good sturdy construction, was lit from inside with lanterns that Thomas had arranged before retreating to his own cabin, with the tact of a younger brother who has developed wisdom. She stood on the porch in the last light and looked at the land and felt Jeremiah come up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him, and the land stretched out in all its enormous truthful beauty, and she thought, I left Kansas City with a lie and $42 and one small bag, and I have arrived here. I have arrived exactly here. The months that followed had the texture of real life, which is to say, they were full of ordinary beauty and ordinary difficulty, and the specific contentment of a person in the right place doing the right things with the right person beside them. She continued teaching. The school grew. 2 new families had settled near Harlo Creek in the spring, adding 4 more students, and a second older student group was formed that met on alternate afternoons, and which Edna taught with a curriculum she had designed herself, drawing on what she knew of the Eastern Academy model and what she had learned about what frontier children actually needed. She applied to the County Education Board for additional funding and received a partial grant and a letter that suggested future expansion was likely. Jeremiah ran the quarter circle with Thomas, and the dispute with Walcott, resolved the previous winter, had a coda. Walcott's broader operation in the territory collapsed in the summer of 1879, when 2 of his fraudulent title claims were simultaneously challenged by better prepared ranchers with better documentation, and the investment group that had backed him withdrew. He left the territory that August, and the ranching community of the area experienced a collective exhale. The ranch prospered with the moderate prosperity of people who work carefully and do not overreach. They added a small library to the ranch house, 2 shelves of books that Edna sourced with the same careful attention she brought to the schoolhouse, and which Jeremiah read from with a steadiness that was one of the private pleasures of her life, to look up from her own book in the evening and see him reading. In the spring of 1880, their first child arrived. He was born on a Tuesday morning in April with the particular vigorous indignation of a person who has views about how this transition should have been handled, which Mrs. Hathaway, who attended, along with the physician Dr. Caraway, said was a very healthy sign. He was dark-haired like his father and had, from his first hours, the quality of paying close attention to everything, which Edna recognized immediately as both familiar and profoundly daunting. They named him James after no one in particular. It was simply the name that, when said aloud in the first hour of his life, sounded correct, the way some names do. Jeremiah held him with the careful competence of a man who is profoundly moved, and is managing it by focusing on the practical details of the hold. He looked at his son with an expression that Edna would remember with clarity for the rest of her life: absolute, unguarded astonishment, and then looked at her, and said nothing at all, which was the most completely articulate thing he could have done. Thomas, outside the door, was audibly unable to contain himself, and when permission was given to enter, he held his nephew with a happiness that was uncomplicated and genuine and made the room brighter. James grew, and the ranch grew, and the school grew, and Harlo Creek grew, as frontier towns did in those years, accruing hardware stores and additional churches, and a newspaper, the Harlo Creek Courier, which began publication in 1881, and promptly became the vehicle through which everyone in the county argued about everything, and the particular character that a community develops when its people decide they intend to stay. Edna was asked in 1881 to chair the newly formed County Education Committee, which was a voluntary position of considerable responsibility and no salary, and she accepted it with the specific energy that she brought to things she cared about. She lobbied through the committee, through the newspaper, through every legitimate mechanism available for improved teacher salaries in frontier schools, for better funding for rural education, for the inclusion of girls' secondary education in the county's planning. Some of these efforts succeeded immediately. Others took longer. Some, she understood, she was beginning rather than completing, and that was also work worth doing. Clara Voss finally made her way to the Kansas Territory in the fall of 1881, recovered from her collarbone and full of her own energy for teaching, and was placed in a school 30 miles north of Harlo Creek, and she and Edna met in person for the first time as frontier women rather than childhood friends, which was a different and better meeting, and they corresponded regularly for the rest of their lives. In the fall of 1882, Edna's second child arrived, a daughter this time, with red in her hair that neither parent could account for, and a disposition of sunny stubbornness that accounted for itself very clearly. They named her Ruth, and from her earliest months she had opinions about the world that she expressed with a directness Jeremiah recognized, and Edna found both amusing and deeply gratifying. James, by then 2 years old, accepted his sister with the philosophical detachment of someone who has assessed the situation and found it manageable, and would grow up to be the kind of older brother who defended her vigorously in public and was outwitted by her consistently in private. The ranch house expanded with its inhabitants, a new room added in 1881, another in 1883, the porch extending around the side of the house where the afternoon shade fell best. The library shelves multiplied. The kitchen garden, which Edna had established in their first spring, and which had grown from a practical necessity into something approaching a serious enterprise, produced vegetables that were traded at the general store, and occasionally contributed to the school's lunch program for children who came the longest distances. Thomas Langston married a woman from the neighboring county named Margaret Holloway in the spring of 1883 and built a proper house of his own on the eastern edge of the quarter circle property. And the children of both families grew up with the ranch as their shared geography, which produced in both sets of children a particular competence with land and animals and wide space that Edna considered one of the best educations they could have. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, June of 1884, Jeremiah and Edna sat on the wide porch of the ranch house in the summer evening, which was the specific western summer evening that is warm without oppressiveness and full of the sound of grass and the last insects and the enormous graduated dark. James was asleep inside. Ruth was not asleep but was quiet, which was the closest Ruth came to it at 15 months. Margaret and Thomas had come for dinner and gone home, and the evening had settled into its final form. Edna was looking at the prairie in its dusk colors and thinking about nothing particular, which was a luxury she had not permitted herself often enough before coming west, the luxury of letting the mind rest while the world did its work. "What are you thinking about?" Jeremiah asked, and it was a question he asked regularly, with genuine interest which never stopped being one of the things she loved most about him. "Kansas City," she said. "The platform. You watching me from the support post while I sat in the window. And," he said, "and the station master who barely looked at the ticket," she said, "and the way I felt when the train pulled out of the station. Like I jumped off a cliff and was waiting to find out if there was water or rocks at the bottom." "Was there water?" he asked. She looked at him, at the face she knew now in all its variations, the stillness and the rare laugh and the particular expression he had in the mornings, and the other one he had when he was working through something difficult, and the one he had when he looked at their children. The face that had looked at her on a station platform in 1878 with the knowledge that she was not who she said she was, and had waited, patiently and with complete respect, for her to be ready to say so. "You already knew," she said, "standing on that platform. You looked at me and you already knew my name wasn't Clara Voss." "I knew the name wasn't yours," he said. "I didn't know what yours was, but you could have said something, at any point." "It wasn't mine to say," he said again, as he had said that day at the fence rail. "You needed to be ready." She reached over and took his hand. His hand, the one with the scar from the rope, held hers with the easy certainty of a hold practiced over 5 years and countless evenings, and all the terrain that two people who love each other traverse together. "Edna Archer," he said, in the tone he had used on the train when she finally gave him her real name. "That suits you better." "Edna Langston now," she said. "That suits you even better," he said. The last of the light went from the prairie, and the stars came out in their full plains abundance, more stars than the east ever showed, more than a city would ever permit, the full and uncontested depth of the sky doing its nightly business of being extraordinary. The night sounds started, the grass, the insects, the distant cattle, the coyote having better luck tonight finding someone to talk to. She thought about the woman who had stood in a Kansas City train station on a September morning in 1878, with a lie in her hand, and a heart full of a need for something she could not name precisely. She thought about the ticket with the wrong name and the station master who barely looked up and the train pulling west, and the man across the aisle who had read George Eliot and watched the crowd with the patience of a hawk. She thought about the schoolhouse and the window pane and Caleb Sutherland's frog and Anna Reeves's story, about Mrs. Hathaway's kitchen and the December dark and the plains snowstorm, and a fire in a parlor where two people finally stopped being careful with each other. About a south field in March with half-mended fences and vows that were already true before they were spoken. About a son sleeping inside with his father's attention, already his greatest characteristic. About a daughter who was 15 months old and already had opinions that she stated with perfect conviction. About the land stretching west in the dark, the land that had asked her to justify her presence and had been given, she thought, a reasonable answer. She had come west with a borrowed name and no particular plan except away, and she had found this, Her name, her work, this man, this life, this porch, this sky. "Jeremiah," she said. He said. "I'm glad the station master didn't look up." He was quiet for a moment, the silence of someone smiling in the dark. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The prairie stretched on in every direction, patient and enormous and indifferent to human measure, except for this small lit place, this porch, these hands, these lives, which had held the way all vast and honest things hold the particular, without possessing it, simply by making room. Ruth made a sound inside that suggested her views on sleep were evolving, and Jeremiah rose without complaint, because he had learned early that there was no logic to who Ruth summoned in the night, and that resistance was not productive. And Edna listened to him go in and speak softly to his daughter in the voice that was entirely different from every other voice. He had low and patient and full of something she could only describe as reverence, until the sounds from inside settled again. He came back and sat down. The stars proceeded. The grass moved in a wind that came from somewhere without a name. They sat together on the porch of the Quarter Circle Ranch in the full dark of the Kansas plains, and the coyote to the south made its declaration again. And this time, faintly, from a different direction, something answered. And Edna Archer Langston, who had once pressed a stranger's ticket into a station master's hand, and called herself someone else in the hope of finding who she actually was, sat in the summer night beside the man who had known her real name all along, and felt the world, this particular corner of it, this hard-won and beloved corner, settle around her like something that had always been meant to be home.